Started. It is my pleasure to introduce three folks to you. Our main speaker this morning is Marcus Thomas from the FBI. He is joined by Steve Schmidt, who will be talking to us tomorrow about recent FBI work on distributed denial of service attacks. And those of you who were lucky enough to hear Mark Eckenweiler yesterday give his tutorial on privacy, that's he on the end. So, Marcus.
Thank you. Let me figure out how to get this screen up so everyone can see. All right. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me here. It's an honor, a privilege to talk. I don't think I've ever spoken to so many laptop computers and notebooks in my life. I think on the agenda, what the agenda called for was a Carnivore update. And for those of you, I'm sure everyone knows what Carnivore is. I want to expand it a bit to be a little broader than just Carnivore. Talk to some of the issues that have been kind of hot issues for us lately in the area of electronic surveillance, particularly on the internet. I have my lawyer here in case there's any tough questions dealing with the law, and we'll turn to him if we have them. What I want to do, though, is I want to make this as informal as I can. First, I'm going to take this coat off. I apologize for being too formal looking here.
Take the tie off.
I'm not allowed during the workday to actually take the tie off. But, I want to make this as informal as we can, question and answers. I have a presentation, as you'll see, ready here, but I'm not going to stick very closely to it. I want to zip through it fairly quickly and get to what I think is more important. I'd like to show you the screens, a couple of screens on Carnivore. I'd like to talk to you also about Dragonware, which has been in the press recently, what that is. Talk about when and how Carnivore is used, and Dragonware for that matter. And then a little bit on how does it work, and I'd like to entertain questions throughout this whole presentation, or at the end we can do that. First of all, I'm sure those of you who were able to come over here on a Sunday evening and listen to Mark Eckenweiler, you know a bit now and have a good grounding in some of the legal aspects of Carnivore. So I wanted to very upfront say, look, Carnivore was developed to focus on our legal requirements for conducting electronic surveillance. Particularly, some of those are the requirement to gather with particularity, that is, to gather only information which the court order says we can get, to be very precise in what we do collect, and to be very comprehensive, that is, to get everything we're supposed to collect and nothing that we're not supposed to collect. So I want to get some of those legal concepts out of the way very quickly at a very high level. Apologize, Mark, for that high level. Carnivore is focused on evidence gathering. That's the distinction really between Carnivore and most of the commercial devices that we've seen or tried. So it is a very, very unique requirement that law enforcement has, and law enforcement working with a carrier in this case. Very unique requirement, and we haven't seen commercial devices quite capable of doing what we needed in a way that met the legal requirements that I talked about, the particularity and comprehensiveness. When we use it and how we use it, first of all, law enforcement agency only uses the Carnivore device with lawful authorization. And when I say that, I mean almost always with a court order. There is some very narrow cases where we might use it if we have permission of a person who's actually communicating, a victim, for instance. But that's very, very unusual. It's almost without exception with a court order. We always use it with the assistance of, I put ISP here, but it's really network or system administrator. We always have assistance from the technical people at the network when we are implementing Carnivore. And we always use it only when it makes sense to use it. So I don't want people to, and I've tried the last few months to make it clear to people that we're not pushing Carnivore as a first choice tool of electronic surveillance on the internet. It's very much the opposite. It is a tool in a tool bag, which is pretty thin right now, but it is a tool, and we use it when it makes sense, when it's the best tool. It may be like the screwdriver in the tool. It has a limited use, but we go to it occasionally because it's the best tool for some processes. A little bit about how it works. First of all, Carnivore filters in stages. It has a very low-level filtering capability to pretty much, I take the word filter back, it's in fact more like a sieve. It blocks data and allows only certain data to pass through. So there's a very low-level filtering sieve, and then there's a next layer up sieve, and then a next layer up. So it's a kind of a stage thing. So it's not the concept where we're sucking information into a box and doing some sort of, massive analysis of it to find out what's interesting, what's not. It filters on addresses. It looks for addresses, not context. So I want to be very clear, we're not using this device to, say, sniff out the word terrorist or bomb or cocaine or something like that and just gather that information wherever it happens to be. The court orders will state what the targeted information is by either an account or a subject's name, a description, an IP address, an internet account name, or something like that, something that gives us the particularity we need. So we're not doing broad searches. Third, it filters entirely in RAM, and that's a key point I think that is important. We're not holding information on the disk, and we could go back and reconstruct it. And then there's two modes. There's a pin trap mode, which if you didn't have a chance to listen to Mark, you probably were having fun yesterday afternoon, but a pin register and a trap and trace just gathers addressing information. It's the equivalent of phone numbers, who communicated with whom, whereas the full content intercept collects everything. In the pin mode, be very clear also about this, in the pin mode we don't collect content. That includes the subject line of emails, for example. It will do limited tracking of dynamic addressing, and then there is also an audit trail within Carnivore system so that we know what it was used for, how it was used, when it was changed, those sorts of things. Quick flash of some pseudo-complex type connection schematic of how it actually connects in. I just want to show this to basically point out that there is an isolation function within Carnivore, and it's right here. There's a commercial device that we use to isolate the network. So Carnivore is not a live, interactive server. It's very much more like a sniffer. And by the way, when I use the word sniffer, I think everybody's very comfortable with what that means. But last week when I gave a presentation, someone came up to me later, just very jokingly said, when you say Carnivore is like a sniffer, you really ought to say Carnivore is like Network Associates' trademark product sniffer. So from now on, I'm going to use protocol analyzer if we're all right with that, and you'll know I mean sniffer when I say protocol analyzer. But the distinction being, the point of this screen is that there is isolation. It's a passive device. It's a one-way tap. So we're looking at information that's flowing through the network, but we're not putting information on the network. There's no agent being put on the network. There's no active server function for Carnivore. Also, Carnivore, you'll note we don't connect it to the internet for the purposes of moving data around. We usually dial in or some secondary network to move data around. Things we quickly cover is that there are operational responsibilities. We distinguish between what is investigative responsibilities, what's a technical responsibility, and clearly there's an internet service provider or network operator responsibility, and those are all segregated to a point that we have some security control over not having our investigators getting access physically to the network. There's a bridge or a buffer in between our technical people, so just want people to understand that this is not an investigator knocking on your door with this device under his arm. There's a highly trained group of technical people who do this part. And we follow a set of procedures that, frankly, were startlingly complicated when we do this. What is Dragonware, real quick before I show it? There was some controversy, I think, last week over the fact that the FBI has a suite of tools, not just Carnivore, but a suite of tools. So, real quickly, what Dragonware is just the concept of Carnivore, the protocol analyzer, if you want to call it that, the sniffer. The second one's called Packeteer. It's simply a packet reconstruction, resequencing piece of software. It does exactly what it sounds like it does. It puts the raw native data back into files by sequencing the packets. And then the third is just a viewer, and you'll see that when I pop it up. It's exactly that. It's a browser, a special browser that that views the information. And then just a little flow. Data is collected. So we can get an arrow here. Data is collected here, usually stored in that it passes a filter and is stored as a filtered set of data. There may be some preparation necessary, but mainly it's reconstructed in Packeteer, it's stored again, and then it's viewed with CoolMiner, which is just a browser. Basically, it's some plugins. So it's a post-processing process. We don't monitor this in a real time, typically. So the issues that I wanted to hit real quick before I go to the demos. Obviously, there's growth in data transmissions, data communications, so there's naturally going to be growth in the amount of law enforcement interest in that. But to give you some rough numbers, the FBI had, I believe, 335 orders last year for Title III, that is communication intercepts, on all communication technologies, wireless, wireline, including data, computer-to-computer type information, internet. So the numbers here are fairly small. There's obviously growth in this kind of communication area, so we expect there to be some growth. Obviously, the number of ISPs is unbelievably large. The number of private networks is growing. It's unbelievably large. So the concepts of strategic intercept capabilities don't make sense. And that's why you see this when I show it. You'll realize it's a very tactical system. The number of law enforcement agencies with the authority to conduct intercepts is growing, or is large. It's not growing much, but it's very large. I don't know how many. I know there are more than 15,000 agencies in America. I don't know how many have a very small fraction of that would have intercept authority, but it's still significant. And again, you'll see the toolbox, think of the toolbox, a very tactical approach. Before I go on, I want everybody to get that flash screen just so they got some contact numbers for me, an email address, and that first M should be lowercase. I don't know if it matters. And then my phone number. All right, I'm going to move now to what's really more interesting, I think, and that's Carnivore demonstration. There are two versions of Carnivore, no secret. That was in the press, I think, yesterday. We had two versions, and I think we've said from the start, there are two versions. There's always two versions of everything. There's one you're using and one you're developing at the very least. There's probably more than that. There's a bunch in the trash can that you already finished using. But the version of Carnivore that we use now, and we use it sparingly, I think we've counted less than 30 times, is this version, 1.34. Not too exciting. This is really not, I mean, when you see this, you'll recognize it for what it is. It's not real exciting piece of software to look at. Carnivore, the software application is this. It runs on normally NT Workstation, could be Windows 2000. Now the screen I showed earlier with all the connection information is a little more complex. There are other parts of the system. There's hardware to isolate Carnivore system from the rest of the network. There's hardware and software to allow Carnivore system to be communicated with by us from another connection, dial-in normally. But the software itself is just a single application. This is the user interface. There's a bunch of libraries associated with it, and then there's a driver that sits on a NIC card, and that's the pieces. It has a start and a stop, and a big red light means it's stopped, and a big green light means it's going. So it's very simple at this level. The advanced screen pops up what is, in fact, the way we would set up Carnivore to intercept. And I will show you the second version because it's very important to see the distinction between the first version and second version. And the main features added by the second version is to simplify this mess. This is a pretty complicated screen for someone. I mean, now people who know how to use it can readily jump to it, but I'll show you why it's fairly complicated. Does everybody see that arrow pretty well? If you can't read the text, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you what it does. In this block here is where we would do fixed IP address intercepts, and I'll just put a fixed IP address in there. And basically, in a network where you could fix the IP address on the particular target, we would. If you could do it within a secure manner, fix the IP address, we fix it. If we can't fix it, we don't use that. But real quick, idea of how that works. You can also add in a range such that if you could fix it to a range and exclusively make sure nobody else is on that range, our job of filtering and finding the bad guy is done. And all we do is use this device to actually collect it, but it's actually sorted by the IP address. So that's one method that we might use to do that. Keeping in mind that there's logic to apply in how this works. So it's a complicated combination of ands and ors that aren't very evident from looking at this screen, and that's why the next version makes it simpler. But an idea is, down here in this block, we tell it what we're trying to do. The default might be to collect nothing. Remember, it's like a sieve. It blocks everything out. Only certain things are allowed through, and we might default to actually collecting nothing. In this particular case, though, we can choose, for this example, TCP ports, either in a pin register mode or a full content mode. Let's say full content because it's very easier, I think, for people to understand what collecting all the content is, as opposed to arguing about what a pin register is or should or shouldn't be. And now the concept in this is you now have a little bit more complicated filter that says collect information to and from these fixed IP ranges that are TCP sessions. So you start to bundle or add ands to the logical question. Other questions? Whoops. Stand by. Wish that would happen. Once you have you've decided or you set it up to do that, you will set up which ports you're interested in intercepting. At this point, the way it's set up, it'll actually intercept nothing because you haven't allowed the CF to pass through certain ports. An example of what you might do is choose a port, and I'll choose email because it's fairly understandable. And everybody knows that ports aren't, hard to find wired in what they do. So I want to point out, though, that this is an example. Very often our target, we do know what port he's using, and we do know why he's using that. They'll use obscure ports for specific reasons. So this allows us to only look at one port if we know and have information that that one port is where the important communications are. But again, you might be able to add ports, like if you knew that they were, for whatever reason, using a range of ports, you could stick in a range here also. Again, acting like a sieve, nothing gets through unless it's checked here. So in this case, let's get rid of SMTP because with this fixed IP address, it doesn't really make sense. So we'll get rid of that one and go with this port range. Now, again, you've added a little more complicated set of filters, and in this case, let's also add like an OR filter here. So the idea, in fact, I'll add back 25, and if we do that, I'll put myself in here, FBI.gov. So in this case, we added a kind of an OR filter. So in this case, OR, it collects on this fixed IP, this port range, or on port 25, where the SMTP address is mthomas@fbi.gov. So give you an idea of kind of what the ranges of what we might set it up to do. All right, and I mentioned limited tracking of dynamic. You can use right here. We can track certain varieties of radius and DHCP type protocols to track, for instance, me logging in. Invalid radius port. Sorry about that. So I put in mThomas and now track whenever I log in using that and get authentication from the network. We would also not only get this fixed range IP address, but also watching for logins on the radius. So basically that kind of gives you an idea of some of the things it does. There's other things like the startup IPs here. If the target's online 24 hours a day and you know he's online this moment, we'll ask the provider what IP address is he currently using, and they'll give it to us. and we can put that in and start collecting instantly. So that's what that does. There's a data text string here. Sounds ominous. Basically, that's to allow us to collect on port 80, but not all webmail. We're very, very rarely interested in, web traffic, not all web traffic. Very, very uninterested normally in people's web browsing. What we are interested in is their web mail. So the data text string allows us to go in, put in a unique filter or a unique string, user identification string, that's used in a couple of the significant varieties of webmail you can imagine, but I won't use any names. And you can eliminate all web traffic, all port 80 traffic, except that to and from your user with that particular webmail in it. So you see you got a very complicated set of ands and ors. Real quick, I'll go to version 2.0 because everybody thinks it's much more ominous. And just show you that the difference is you get a logical structure. So I can add a filter that says fixed IP address. Again, I can say data from the IP address to the IP address or both. And I say OK, and I end up now with start to build more of a logical structure. So again, does the same thing. It's just a very, very much more logical. The other thing this allows you to do is add knots. So if you wanted to add in a certain IP address that you knew belonged to something that was totally uninteresting to anyone, and e-commerce sites may be very common, or newspaper sites. Who wants to see a guy check his stock updates 50 times a day? If you're very interested in only evidence of a crime, you're not interested in that. So we can actually add not filters in there. And you can start to add filters and add filters. So you get a fairly complicated string of what you're doing. In fact, you can pretty much narrow it down to a single session going through. That's the idea. Any questions? I'm glad to take questions here while this is up. If anybody wants to ask, we don't have to wait till the end. Good. All right. Had your chance. Next thing I want to do, because it was in the press, we haven't talked a lot about the back end of this process because no one asked any questions about it, but we haven't made any effort not to talk about it. It's not classified, not secret, not particularly spooky or ominous, but the back end of this is what you do to process and look at this data. When we collect data, as anybody knows here, it's a native form. It's just TCP packets dumped on a disk. There's a little bit of overhead to tell us timestamps and name of file and things like that to kind of set it up so we know what it is from looking at it later. But without some device, in this case we use a thing called Packeteer, you're not going to be able to reconstruct it, you're not going to be able to look at it, it's just a bunch of jumbled information. Anybody that's ever looked at a hex dump obviously knows it's not the way you want untrained people to pour through information. It works okay for tech people maybe, but if they're looking for particular information, but it's terrible if your obligation is to look at all the information and understand it, which is what our obligation is. So an idea here is a device that just simply takes in, and I'll put the whole folder in, it takes in any data that we mine. This is all test data that we've collected, and you hit the big run button. Again, we try to make it as simple as we can. And it's just reconstructing the packets. It looks just like any application would do. It tries to recognize which sessions belong together and put them all back together, and then it tries to write them as files, and then it builds links. That's the one extra thing it does. It builds links to all of those and puts it in this thing I'm calling out38 directory. And the reason it does that is so that we can very easily, with a browser essentially, point to the link file and have all the information we need to go back and look at that. Now those of you that got a chance to listen to Mark yesterday know, and those of you who don't, I'll tell you. We're obligated when we do electronic surveillance to look at what we intercept. And the reason is, even though we've intercepted it, that doesn't mean necessarily that there's any reason to believe that it's criminal. There's certainly no reason for us to disclose it to anyone. So this information gets sealed, and we're under obligation to protect it. We can look at it and the very first time we look at it, we make a cut, a decision. Is it relevant to the crime? Is it relevant to this court order that we're looking at? And should be included in the order, or is it not? And if it's not, we basically dispose of it. Now, we throw nothing away, as you can imagine, but we seal it and present it to the court, and the court orders it sealed, so we don't look at it again. Our investigators don't get access to it. And what we keep, which is a very small subset of what we may have to intercept, is what's relevant. Discussions of criminal activity, for instance, or discussions of who your criminal conspirators are. Those sorts of things we keep. Those are moved on to the investigator to use as they see fit to conduct the investigation. In doing that, as you can imagine, if you're listening with earphones on a telephone call, it's very simple. Guy's talking about criminal activity, you record it. If he's not, you turn it off. That's the way we do it. Very much a different process here. Because the internet really is a batch-type communication, particularly things like email, and because it takes processing to understand what's going on, we're talking about a situation here where it's very much post-process. But we still follow that rule. We look at the data. If it's relevant, we keep it. If it's not, we seal it with the court, and it goes away. In order to do that, you've got to have a way to actually look at all of the data. You're obligated to look through all of it. And this is the tool which we use, CoolMiner. And just so you know, the defense is also able to get access to the same data in the event that we bring this to a trial. And they would use a very similar device or this very device to look at the data themselves. And the first thing we do is tell it to process what we've reconstructed. And there's the pointer to the input data, and I'll submit it. And it's just going through the reconstruction program's pointer file and rebuilding the pointers and putting building summary screen. And that's basically it. Now, in this case, I used a lot of intercept tests. We normally wouldn't see people using, AOL Instant Messenger, Internet Chat, Net Meeting, FTP, Web Traffic Telemetry. You may or may not in one file. So I've used about 15 different files here just to show you what it would do. But in this case, it tells the monitor who's sitting here looking at this, the first person and the only person who gets access to the raw data is the monitor. And he's looking at it and he says, well, there's 8 web pages here. You click on that, it lists the 8, the IP address is 2, and from, the start times and stop times, and the file size. Port.
Excuse me, could you go back a slide?
Where do you want me to go back to? Right here?
Yeah, I just noticed that you had H.323 protocols down there.
Yeah.
So in addition to having access to a specific portion of the network, you also need access to the ALG that cooperates with the NAT in order to get the inbound stream location for the H.323?
Keep in mind, that may or may not be true, but keep in mind what this device does is it's ignorant of what was collecting it. So Carnivore is one device that could collect and feed information into the CoolMiner. But there are other ways of us getting data. It could be handed to us by a service provider. It could be collected off of a TCP dump type function. It could be collected off of a modem, actually, demodulating a modem. And that's probably more common where we'd be demodulating a modem, where we get the whole data stream because it has to be on that modem. So there's a lot of different ways where data might flow to Carnivore. The two CoolMiner, that Carnivore may actually not be capable of doing. But basically, Carnivore, all it can do...
Let me ask the question directly then. Is Carnivore capable of working with an application layer gateway associated with a NAT to do the inbound stream for an H.323 or STP stream?
Not right now. All Carnivore can do now is passively sniff what it knows. And I can tell you right now, it's very, very limited in what it knows. Example is if it knows that a user is using a specific address, it can sniff that, and it'll get everything on that link to and from that address, but it can't interact in any way with the network to get more information right now.
Well, that's not true. You've just shown us on previous slides both DHCP and radius traffic.
Right.
In order to do the association between the radius server's information and what the end user gets, you have to have some interaction with the radius server.
Well, I wouldn't call it an interaction. There is a passive, if that message is not passively there, Carnivore can't get it. Now that's one of the issues. That's a good point. If a lot of radius servers, you know, aren't used, obviously they're used differently, and that information, if it's not there, we don't get it. And that's one of the reasons we work with service providers to find out how is your network working, what's there. So it can passively look at other things that are happening. If it sees an assignment of an IP address, for instance, it can passively see that, but it can't actually do anything to get that information.
I think one of the questions that's in the back of the minds of a lot of people here, and for the M-Bone, my name is Ted Hardy and I work for Equinix, is what devices on the network of an internet service provider do you have any active interaction with? And I'm hearing you say there are no devices on a network that you have active interaction with. Is that a true statement, or am I mishearing you?
With Carnivore, that is true. Obviously, if we don't use Carnivore, that might be different, but with Carnivore, that's true. Now, let me pop back real quick to a screen here. The reality of how we set this up is it gets a little complicated, and because we rely on service providers to show us where to connect. Believe it or not, we don't go in like you see on television and say, you know, out of the way, this is my operation. We don't have the knowledge, obviously, with your networks to do that. Yeah. I love computers, really. Give you a quick idea. I list here.
Let me actually assert that your claim that you never come in and say, I want to insert this box in your network without coordinating with the service provider is just plain false. Because the service provider that I used to work for had the phenomenon happen that the FBI, without a court order, forced a cable technician in Comcast in Maryland to insert a hub that was not in fact able to do full duplex into my network to connect to a machine that only worked full duplex and caused a major outage for the company I used to work for. So that claim is just plain false.
Actually, we're in a good situation here. You happen to have in front of you the one person in the room who knows what he's trying to talk about. And I can tell you that's not true. It's not true. Come on back up.
Let me be clear. That absolutely happened, and I will sign an affidavit that it happened, and there are other witnesses that it happened, and ultimately what happened was our legal counsel called the FBI. This is 2.5 years old, so it may predate Carnivore, but it absolutely did occur.
Oh, I didn't say that.
And there are enough people in this room who know me personally to know that I'm credible on this.
I agree
and
with
those of you who are in here and know where I used to work, you know which particular ISP this happened to, and our security manager went semi-non-linear when this happened. Yeah. But did in fact calm down enough to call people he knew at FBI, and we also actually pointed out to the cable operator that they were in violation of statute because cable operators have additional set of statutes prohibiting them from collecting data about subscriber traffic.
Yeah.
And so don't go making bold claims that are in fact not factual.
Okay, listen, I'm not the one making bold claims here. Listen, I didn't come here to fight with you people. I really didn't. I promise you I did not. But
I'm sorry, a bold claim is we never interfere with an ISP's network without their permission. That's a bold claim. It's also false.
okay, stand by. I didn't say an ISP network, I said a network operator, first of all. Now listen, again, I did not come here to fight with you. Well, not all operators are ISPs, right? I mean, well, they may be, but not everybody is an ISP. They're not to me. So let me go back. That event did occur, but not exactly as you remember it or what was relayed to you. First of all, I'll tell you there was a court order. There was a court order. There's always a court order in a case where we do this. The very rare exception would be, like I said, if there were permission, but we would not go to a service provider. There's no way we would go to a service provider and expect them to respond to a case where we were asking permission for a victim, unless they were a victim. So it just doesn't happen that way. There was a court order. Secondly, I don't know how much of that is still sealed or not, but I can tell you this. I agree with you. There was a complex relationship in that case between the internet service provider and the person who had physical control over the equipment and ran the equipment, owned the equipment. So that was a little complicated. And that was something that this cable operator in this particular case took a responsibility for. So it's a complicated situation. But the bottom line is, and I'll show you right here what happened in that case. We rely on, oops, let me get back. We rely on this part right here where I say segment from ISP. We don't just go in and say, here, hook it up, because you have to know where to hook it. So we normally, always, we're relying on the ISP operator, whoever you call it, the technical people who understand the architecture of the network to pinpoint the connection where that's going to be installed. And in the particular case of that one, and in almost every case, very often the ISP will configure a connection. Now in this case, you're right, there was a complication there where the ISP was doing things they weren't authorized to do under the agreement with their company. That's true, we didn't know that, but it was happening. But they did configure that link using a router that wasn't full duplex on a full duplex line. And to be honest with you, my technician told the guy it wouldn't work, and he said, no, it'll work, don't worry about it, and we let him hook it up. And we plugged into it. That's all we did, is plug into the router, the hub. Well, I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to move on because I'm not interested. I'll be glad to take it. You want to call me, I'll sit down with you and we can talk about it. But I'm not going to sit here and fight with you over it. It's senseless to do that. So let's don't worry about that, other than to move on and tell you people that what I had intended to show. And I apologize if you think that, and I apologize if in any way, and I do know it did interfere with the network. I know it did. And we apologized for that at the time. We removed that instantly when, well, actually we didn't. We told him to do it, not him, but the person who called said, take it out immediately, and we never reinstalled it. But it had nothing to do with what we did. It did have something to do with an attempt by the cable company to help us implement a Title III. It certainly did. But I don't think we did anything wrong in that case. But the point being that this ISP has to usually work with us to find a point to connect. There's no doubt about it. And very often they do things on that network to make that happen. Most of them know exactly what they're doing, and they cause no harm. We appreciate that kind of effort together. Let's go back to Cool Miner real quick, just to show you what it does. An example is the web traffic, and you click on a particular link. There's my splash screen. Another one might be, it's the same one. Let's find one down here. So there's arrows. Apologize for using anybody's actual name, but I happen to have had that screen inside our test network. It's probably some good advertising. I don't know. Maybe it's bad. By the way, the FBI's not in any way looking at arrows, I can tell you. Other things, again, Telnet. You can look at Telnet and step through the to's and the froms on a Telnet session. Just something basically, so a monitor can look at this data without a hex dump, hex editor can look at it and actually see what it is, and then they mark it to keep or don't keep, that type of thing. And that's what this project does, or this product. If this were not full content intercept, if it were just pin register, obviously when you click on the link, you wouldn't get the content, you just simply get the to, the from IP address in that particular case of web traffic. If it was SMTP, you get, depending on what the order said, the to and the from address and the IP addresses. Now, before I go, I want to jump to Mark Eckenwire real quick, because there was a legal question that came up in that last argument that
get into another fight over this, but the gentleman in the back who's very excited made reference to a statute that he claimed prohibited cable providers from providing information without notice to their subscribers. In fact, I think if you check the legislative history of that statute was amended in 1992 and is a little involved, but like Marcus, I'm happy to talk to you about that. It in fact makes clear that you don't have to give notice to the object of a Title III order if you're a cable company. Congress specifically foresaw that problem. So just narrow point here, not really related to Carnivore. But Marcus, a couple questions here.
All right. Yeah, this is actually a little bit more on the technical side. I note that you guys are using radius tracking to, follow a specific target in the event of basically a dynamic environment. Given that most of us are running large distributed authentication environments,
Right.
I sort of wonder basically the practical use of that. Are there any plans to expand Carnivore to be a distributed system to allow you to track across multiple sites? Because that's the only way I could see that being effective in a large portion of our networks.
Right, well, that's a good question. The answer is simple. No, there's no plans, and it has a limited application. Carnivore was designed and not. By the way, just getting back to that other argument, before that actually happened, there was no Carnivore, or when that happened. So Carnivore is since that time. We're looking at 18 months to 2 years, really, that's been usable. It's really just a tool designed for what we were seeing at the time, and for the most part, it was and has been small ISPs running, for the most part, in a single link type of environment. Now, we're seeing changes, obviously, and we're beginning to rely more and more on the network's operators' capabilities to do some of that stuff. But no, right now, Carnivore is kind of a limited, unique kind of application tool. It'll probably die a fairly quick death at some point as things continue, technology continues to really outpace it. We'll go back to the tool bag for more tools. And what I had hoped and will hope is that those tools are, as much part of the commercial environment or the non-government toolbox as there are ours. So, long answer, but no. Thank you. All right. Let's go to this side.
Hello, Sean Down, Equinix. My question is probably more directed to Mark, but since you're up there, I'll ask you. Yesterday, someone suggested I ask a question about the application of this at exchange points, where the demarcation between providers is extremely fuzzy, and the ownership of the exchange point network versus the provider network is also frequently fuzzy. How do you decide upon whom to serve the order in an exchange point situation?
I'm wondering if that's not a tech question, but the simple answer might be I might have the order directed at both and let them sort it out with the tech agent. I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer for that, but certainly I can make the order applicable as to both at that pairing point, if that's
And a more specific application of this is there happens to be a major exchange point on the West Coast that is operated by NASA, a government agency. Are the rules different because it's a government agency operating the exchange point versus a commercial carrier?
No.
We'll go back to this side.
Hi, Len Sassman, KnownSafe. People seem to have gotten hung up on the idea of whether or not we can trust the FBI not to do anything nefarious, and I'm not saying that's not an issue to be concerned about, but what I'd like to know is these Carnivore boxes you're putting on the network, are they accessible remotely by any means?
They are. There's usually a dial-in port, just a dial-in, plain old telephone modem line, and we could go to something different like an ISDN or something, but we haven't put it back on the network, so you can't get to it through the network. But you can dial into it. That's protected in a couple of ways, through the software, but also through a hardware device that protects that. We could go up to encryption if necessary to protect that. Depends on what's called for in the case. But the reasoning for it being accessible to the outside is one, as an operational need. Obviously, if you're working a case and you're looking for information that's critical, like when somebody's going to be killed, or when some load of, say, cocaine or something's going to be dropped, or when a bomb's going off. You want to regularly get access to your data. And the FBI culture, we're used to listening to people real time as they speak, and we can't have that here. So we have to have a method for being able to very quickly, say once an hour, once every 2 hours, check that, pull it down, look at it, see if there's anything going on. The other part is, there's a limited amount of storage space on a removable drive. So you want to check it and see if it's time to go pick the thing up physically. And then third, sometimes the parameters of your order change. You add targets. Once the order's signed and it's served, all you have to do is access that and change the filter. Well, we don't have our field agents going out and doing that, so that would be done from a central location. So there has to be that. So.
Sure, that's all very reasonable. And my concern is you're basically putting capability to monitor a huge range of information. Whether or not you actually do that is, of course, case by case and what you're allowed to do. But you're putting that facility in there so that if somebody were to gain unauthorized access to a Carnivore box, they would be able to gain access to a lot of private information that nobody should be looking at. Is there any way that somebody could compromise a Carnivore box?
Well, certainly. I mean, it's vulnerable physically where it sits. We rely upon there's no FBI presence where it sits in the network, so we rely on the ISP security. Now, obviously, an ISP has a lot more capable and dangerous tools sitting around themselves, and generally they could do similar things. So we're not worried about their security. We pretty much obviously trust them to secure our device just like all the rest of their devices. So there's physical security there. As for dial-in, it depends on how secure you want to go, but there is a device, a hardware, firmware, device on the line that attempts to block unauthorized callers from coming in. We've evaluated it, but we haven't evaluated it exhaustively. I hope this Carnivore review will be, in part, an exhaustive review of the security question, because we don't. I mean, obviously we don't want to put this in there and then have bad guys dialing into it. I mean, sure, that would be ridiculous. Now, some carriers choose to disconnect it, and that's fine. We would call them up and say, "I'm about to dial in. Could you connect it?" And they'll do that, and that works. It obviously annoys people sometimes if we call them a lot, but that could be one way of doing it, and we do that occasionally.
Thank you.
Right.
Elliot Lear, Cisco Systems. So several times you mentioned, when I guess you were talking about the analysis tool Packeteer, how it has the ability to manage or to put together some of these streams, like as Ted was talking about, H323, and you mentioned that Carnivore doesn't have really the capability to put that stuff to do much with that today. So my only question to you is, are you using data sources other than Carnivore?
When you say data sources, you're talking about do we take data into this process from things other than? Sure. Some carriers have their own systems. Some ISPs, have their own systems. Some use for the particular application. Maybe some have already done some things. If they're the victim, you could put TCP dumps an example. You could put that data in here. There are devices for doing intercepts on modems I talked about. We can take those in, and also another protocol analyzer. Commercial off-the-shelf protocol analyzers could be used. Their output could flow into that. So, but Carnivore is the only product we design and build to do internet type sniffing at an ISP network. Right.
Brett Hahn, RCN. It's actually two questions. The first question, you say you have a phone line that you can connect. Whose responsibility is that to provide?
Phone line?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's our responsibility. We pay for that.
All right,
but
I
it's
just
got
have
to come to the facility
of being the guy that usually ends up having to put that
Yeah.
stuff together. The other question, what assurances do we have from the FBI that when you dial in, you will not change the monitoring parameters?
Mm-hmm. Good question. And I should point out that's one of the distinctions between version 1.3.4 I showed and 2.0. What 1.3.4 does is when a user dials in or initially sets it up, when they hit the go button, or actually when you hit the save button, it saves a log file. And when you hit the go button and it starts collecting, it writes to the log file. So there is a log file that shows how the filter was set up and the times and that sort of thing. You can check to see who logged in to do that. Once we leave and remotely dial back in, make any changes, all that's stored on a log file. So there's an auditing capability using the log file.
Well, that's all well and good, but do we have access to that?
Well, that's a good question. And the answer is yes, you do in certain circumstances. You, as a member of the public, would not, or you as an ISP may or may not. But the information is stored with the actual intercepted data, and it becomes a part of the court record. So it's available to, say, a criminal subject who's indicted. If this information is evidentiary, he's going to have access to that log information.
Well, you'll pardon my paranoia when it comes to the FBI, but as our esteemed colleague down here pointed out, you guys aren't exactly the most trustworthy individuals on the planet. I fail to see where, I mean, I come from an ISP. It's pretty common to write backdoors into stuff so that you can make modifications without anybody else knowing.
Right.
How do we know that you haven't done that?
I agree 100%. You're absolutely right. In part, I think the Department of Justice took up the independent review to just take a look and say, what are we doing? It's a snapshot in time, though, and we all know that. We all know that the reality is, the machine's sitting there connected to the network. What's to stop me from having another device loaded on another piece of software? Absolutely right. The answer, I think, is very complicated, but it gets down to why you know that I'm not out listening to your phone calls at the pole outside your house.
Oh, I don't know that.
You don't, and that's right. But I can tell you this, and
I imagine after this conversation you might be.
What was the name again? So everyone sitting up here will tell you that, sure, healthy skepticism of the government activity is absolutely essential, and we appreciate that and understand it. But there are laws in place to prevent us from doing it. And I'll just tell you, I'm a citizen of the United States. I have the same privacy concerns you have. I don't want to go to jail to solve a case. Now, could someone do it? They absolutely could. But they could also plant evidence at a crime scene, and they could intercept phone calls that are not internet related.
Oh,
You're
so
right.
standard FBI method.
There's a legal. I'm sorry, I didn't. There's laws in place to prevent us from doing it. Also, it's not simple to carry one of these out. As we talked and argued and fought even here, it's very clear that this is a complicated procedure. For me to just go out and show up and say I want to do a court order, it's not normally done that way. It can't be done that way. Obviously, the Department of Justice knows about it. If we're trying to do an intercept, if we're trying to do even a PIN register, the United States Attorney who works for the Department of Justice knows about it. So two agencies are involved. Our legal people know about it, our investigators know about it, and our technical people know about it, and the ISP knows about it. And usually at two levels, the legal and the technical, and sometimes in the executive management of the ISP. So basically, yeah, you're right, it sounds like something that would be very easy, and it could happen. But the reality is, to pull it off and not leave a trace of evidence would be extraordinarily complex. A lot of people know about it. Mark?
To that as well. Marcus, I don't know how much you've really laid emphasis on this. The idea is that Carnivore is not the device of first resort, and what we prefer to do, overwhelmingly, if we need to do a Title III, an interception, choice one is get a court order directed to the provider, have the provider do it, cull the data, produce that data to us. So I think the simplest answer is not to have Carnivore in your network, is actually to comply with the lawful process, entered by a U.S. judge.
Thank you.
Dwight Ernest from RCN. An enormous amount of the suspicion that surrounds Carnivore could have been lifted with a more appropriate response to EPIC's requests for information, especially the release of the source code, even if not to the public, then to some sort of independent review. Could you comment on that? And before you do, I'd just like to compliment you for coming here today, because I think that you showed a lot of guts in doing so.
I'll save the thank you on the last part until I get to that door back there. Yeah, I will comment on that. I appreciate the need to have information about what we're doing. Absolutely appreciate that, and I understand everyone's desire to want to know that. And we have, in a situation where we have protection of the order, that is, we serve an order on an ISP, we provide much more information about what we're doing than I'm able to provide here or than we were able to provide in response to ethics FOIA requests. Working with a particular ISP, we don't hold back anything. We tell them exactly what's going on. But again, the order requires that they not talk about that. Now, I don't want to start that fight all over again. That was 3 years ago, and I'm here now, and I'm telling you, we do that now. The reason we don't provide the source code, for example, or more information is that it's our opinion that that would be an imprudent thing for the FBI to do, given that it's our job, among other things, to enforce electronic surveillance violations, but also to turn over a tool to anybody that could be used to violate the law would not be prudent. We don't sell guns, for instance, as the FBI. We could, but we don't. So I think there's even a federal law against that right now. So we don't do that. So I mean, basically that's it. We don't think it'd be prudent for us to make that capability available.
This is a little bit of follow-on to
Okay, two last questions.
that issue and the last question. You've stated this several times, right? Basically that you don't want to go to jail for doing illegal wiretap.
Yeah, I really don't.
Right. Wouldn't you feel a lot more comfortable if the determination of whether you were doing that or not was in the hands of experts in the courts, rather than any hacker who really feels like decompiling the source and trying to figure out from decompiling the object?
Sure. Yeah. You know, there's a good argument. There's good arguments about that. Bottom line is the process will have to stand the test ultimately in court. I mean, it's already being looked at by this independent review. That's one thing. And then ultimately it will have to stand the test in court. At some point, a judge is going to say, "How did you collect this information?" You got to answer for that. And it's up to him as to what detail he allows to be discussed. And I tell you, it can get into some excruciatingly low-level details. So we have no doubt that this will be evaluated in great detail, ultimately. But to do it in a public forum, we consider to be more dangerous than productive. That's a call that we've made. I think the Department of Justice agrees with us on it. So we had to decide one way or the other. We believe that would be more dangerous than beneficial.
I think ISPs might be just as concerned about the expertise of the court as the veracity of law enforcement in this case.
Well, I can't even comment on that one. Last question, unfortunately, but you can all email me. Feel free to email me or call me. I usually return phone calls, but I'm usually there. But you might get me. Feel free to call me and talk about it.
What do you do in cases where the subject is using encryption, non-public key encryption?
Well, that's a good question. Before I say that, let me get back real quick to this point. I didn't hit it very hard, but about 80% of what we've done with Carnivore has been national security cases and not criminal cases. So just give you an idea of why we're a little sensitive about what we say and do. But the answer to that is, particularly with regard to Carnivore, nothing, because it just doesn't deal with that. Encryption is a big problem. We definitely recognize that. I mean, it's maybe not a problem for you all, but it's a problem for us. So the answer is, though, this device itself and this suite of devices really can't deal with it. If you had encrypted an attachment, for instance, you would see it literally as a jumbled mess. We don't have the ability to do that right now.
What percentage of your cases would you say are thwarted by encryption?
I don't know the exact numbers right now. I can say that it's growing. I can say that it's more common to find encryption in cases where we seize static data, where someone stored data on a hard drive, for example, and we seize it. That's something else that, again, not an issue for Carnivore, but that's another way we may get data. Much more common, still probably in the low teens at the most percentages. On the electronic surveillance side, it's very rare for us. So, but I don't know. It's growing. We're starting to see the trend move upward. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.